Hey buddy, Crow back again with another Evercade video. This time we're going to be looking at the cartridge Atari Lynx Collection one. This has 17 games on it, and if you're a little bit familiar with Collection 2, that actually has 8 games on it, and you may be wondering, well, why does one Lynx Collection have 17 games and the other one has 8 games? And I think it just boils down to whoever owns the publishing rights to these games at this point in time. All the games on this collection, I believe the publishing rights are owned by Songbird Productions. Now these are games that either were originally released for the Lynx, or they're homebrew titles that are currently being published by Songbird Productions, or they're older games but with additional things put into them, like for example Crystal Mines 2. There's additional levels thrown into that game, for example. Now, as for me, I never actually owned Lynx myself until the late 2000s, back when I was collecting just about anything that was video game related. But over the past several years, I've been kind of selling stuff off that I have no nostalgia for, or things that I just kind of don't like or can't see myself playing again. But when it comes to the Atari Lynx, every time I look at this and I turn it on to test it, I wind up playing it, and I'm just always blown away by the capabilities of this system for the year that it came out in, which is, I believe, like the late 80s, like 89, around the same time the Game Boy was released. You've got speech, you've got scaling. The system is amazing. The only thing is the really big chunky graphics when you kind of blow it up on a TV. But that could kind of be forgiven because there's really good games on this thing, and I just can't sell it. I'm that impressed by this thing. So it's funny is the games on this cartridge are 17 of them. I think I actually own one of them, even though I do have 20 something odd Lynx cartridges. But some of these are homebrew, like I said. But let's talk about how I'm gonna rank these games, because I do rank them on a scale from 1 to 5. A 5 is a game that I would consider great, something I had a really good time playing, something I wouldn't really change much about. A 4 is what I'd call a good game, a game I still had a good time playing, but I feel if there were some tweaks here or there, it could have been a great game, and I could have even more fun with it. A 3 is what I'd consider an okay game, a game I'm kind of on the fence about. I neither not like it or do like it. It's just I can't decide if it's good or bad. Maybe it's not the right type of game for me. 2 is what I would consider to be a poor game, a game I didn't really have a whole lot of fun playing, but I could see some merits to maybe going back and playing it again. And a 1 is what I would consider to be just a flat out bad game. This is a game I would not want to go back and play for any reason at all. I don't understand why they put it on the Evercade, for example. It's actually very rare that I give a game a score of 1 or a rank of 1, because they do a pretty good job with the games they select for the Evercade. And also I'm ranking these games based on how they play on the Evercade, not on the original Lynx hardware itself. So things like save states come into play. And seeing as that the Lynx is a handheld and the Evercade itself is a handheld, things should translate pretty fairly well, don't you think? So let's jump into our first game. First up is Awesome Golf from 1991, which is, as you may have guessed, a golf game. I've always been a fan of golf games, and I've been playing them as far back as Golf on the Atari 2600, and I found that they can either be fun or frustrating. I've found Awesome Golf to lean towards more of the fun end of that spectrum. There are 3 full 18-hole courses, and you've got a few options you could do on each. You can select what your golfer looks like, practice on the driving range, practice any hole you'd like, or play a full round. The game moves along at a brisk pace, as for each shot you'll aim on an overhead map, select a club, and then shoot using a pretty standard 3-button system. Once to start the meter, once to select the power, and then one last time for accuracy. The game even has voice samples that can be turned on or off. The only complaint I have about this game is that it doesn't tell you what range each club is used for. You have a caddy that you could talk to, but he won't help you in such matters apparently. Maybe it's something that I'm just used to having in more modern golf games, but it would have been helpful to have that information on screen while selecting a club. Even without the manual, I guess you could try out all the clubs at the driving range and figure that out yourself, but I always feel the game could have just told me. Overall, I'll give this game a 4. Although I think I could have given it a 5 if the club range details were given before or even during each shot. The second game on the cart is Basketbrawl, and this is a street sports basketball game where there's a heavy focus on attacking your opponents. And if this seems a little familiar, that's because I've already talked about Basketbrawl back on the Atari Collection 2, when the Atari 7800 version of the game was included in that. This version for the Lynx has some similarities and differences. Once again, power-ups appear on the court that can increase your speed, power, and health. Not just power-ups, but weapons will also be available to use against your opponents. And that guy at the bottom of the screen that throws knives at you returns as well. And if I'm not mistaken, a lot of the same characters from the 7800 version return here as well. One major difference here is that you no longer have anybody else on your team. I say you because it's not uncommon in this game for you to face off a team of 2 or 3 people. It may not seem fair, but the approach to this game is more of an arcadey game where challenges are to be overcome rather than a fair sports game. There are other characters on the sidelines, but I really don't think they belong to either team, but they will be more than happy to jump on the court and start beating up on players from time to time. One improvement this game makes is that once a character loses all his health, they will eventually regain some and then will be able to rejoin the game rather than just lay on the court for the rest of the game. But that's really the only improvement I can say this game has. My biggest problem with this game is the frame rate. It's really terrible. I played for about 45 minutes and I simply could not get used to it. If anything, it started to make my eyes hurt a bit. I also feel like the game progresses way too slowly. You basically start in one location and have to win 3 matches before going on to the next level. 3 matches! And each game can take 6 minutes. So you have to play a 1-on-1 game, then a 1-on-2 game, and then a 1-on-3 game, all against the same team before moving on to a new location and repeat it all again. Oh, and if you're worried about the fairness of those 1-on-3 games, don't worry, the opponent AI can be incredibly dumb at times. Sometimes they are so distracted by something on the court, they won't bother you from shooting hoops on your own for a while. I'm going to give this game a 2. It was easily worse than the 7800 version, but I would have bumped this up a notch if the frame rate wasn't so bad, as that's the primary thing that'll keep me away from playing this game in the future. Game 3 is Crystal Mines 2 Buried Treasure, and the release date is listed as both 1992 and 2003, and my first thought was, well, how does that work? Well, Crystal Mines 2 was released for the Lynx in 1992, but then in 2003, Songbird Productions re-released this game with 125 more levels added. So despite owning this game myself, I never really played it until just recently, and it turns out this game is a lot like another game I'm a fan of, Boulder Dash, except now you're a robot with a gun. So you navigate the caverns with the ability to shoot the dirt away, encountering monsters that must be eliminated or avoided, and proceed to the next level once all the gems are collected. There's a wide variety of terrain and creatures that can react differently to your shots, and there are some power-ups that can be collected as well, along with some TNT that can be used to eliminate some of the tougher enemies and terrain, and sometimes the levels require some trial and error as you learn how your actions cause the objects in the map to react. So, like the game Boulder Dash, this is really an action puzzler with a bit more action since you can shoot while running around. I think this game was extremely fun and it easily gets a 5 from me. The fourth game is CyberVirus and is surprisingly a first-person shooter. Created in 2002 by Songbird Productions, CyberVirus is a pretty simplistic first-person shooter compared to what we have today, or even what we had in 2002. But the limitations are understandable seeing that this is the Lynx we're talking about, but at the same time it's really impressive for the hardware that was released in 1989. The game plays out as follows. You're given a mission, they teleport you to the game map that's populated with buildings, pickups, and terminators. You run around the map completing those objectives for the mission, which could be things like destroying structures or picking up items, and then when you've done that, you run off the map and you're transported back. To complicate matters, your loadout can vary from mission to mission, so you may need to do things like destroy buildings but have to find grenades on the map to be able to do it first. or you may have low ammo in general, so you have to complete your task while avoiding or outrunning the Terminators. It's interesting to see a first-person shooter on the Lynx, and the controls really aren't that bad considering the buttons available. The D-pad moves around, one button fires your weapon, and the other allows you to run faster and strafe. The start button cycles through your 3 weapons, and holding down the select button brings up your map. One of the problems I had was with the pickups that were on the ground, as due to the resolution of the Lynx, it could be very difficult to distinguish items from just about anything else in the game. I mean, is that rubble or is that a pickup? You have to really be on top of it to tell. Also, since you can't look up or down, I sometimes had a bit of an issue moving directly on top of the item to even pick it up. I also thought it was kind of bizarre the way your character keeps moving forwards or backwards until you hit the button in the opposite direction. I mean, I never really played a first-person shooter with cruise control before. I mean, I'm sure the game is just fine, but I'm going to give this a rating of 3 because it just really didn't interest me that much. I mean, it is pretty slow-paced and tedious for a first-person shooter, but again, it's probably down to the hardware it was made for. Although I do kind of want to bump it a notch just for the death and game over screens. Game 5 is Dracula the Undead, and this is somewhat of a point-and-click adventure game based on Bram Stoker's Dracula. The game originally came out in 1991, and I'm wondering if this was made to take advantage of the popularity of the movie Bram Stoker's Dracula, but that came out a year later in 1992, so I'm not really sure. What's curious is that Bram Stoker seems to be a bigger part of this game, as the game's adventure is being told to you by him. He's there in the beginning to give you a lengthy introduction, and every so often he interrupts the game to offer more narrative. The plot of the game is just a portion of the book. You play as Jonathan Harker, who's trapped in Dracula's castle, and you must escape. That's it. Now, I say this is somewhat of a point-and-click adventure because you are actually in control of Jonathan Harker, but when you want him to interact with stuff, you have to switch to the command prompt at the bottom of the screen and dial in what you want him to do. Once you get the buttons straightened out, it's pretty simple to do. Also, the game pops up boxes indicating which objects can be interacted with, so that's handy as well. The graphics are chunky as you'd come to expect from the Lynx, but also everything is done in this heavy sepia tone, which adds a lot to the game's environment, but as a downside to this, some things may be difficult to find. I mean, it took me quite a while before I realized there was a door in the back of the room I started the game in. I mean, it's just not visible. Also, when I entered the dining room for the first time, I was in there a good while before I even noticed Dracula was in the room with me. And then I had a good chuckle as I thought it was funny that I didn't notice. I mean, is it me? Am I just not that observant? The sound is very, very sparse in the game as well. I wonder if that was done intentionally for atmosphere, but if you're trying to solve puzzles in the game, you could go a good long time without the game even making a sound. Also, the original game suffered due to a lack of a save game feature. However, with the Evercade, that's no longer an issue with the ability to use save states. Overall, I'll give this game a 4 and say it's good. What prevents me from giving it a 5 is the slight tedium of the game and the fact that I nearly fell asleep trying to solve puzzles due to the lack of sounds. Game 6 is Gordo 106, and here we have the only platformer in this collection. You play as a lab chimp who has escaped from his cage and is now on his way to escaping for good while freeing as many other animals as he can. Gordo can run, jump, swing, and throw fruit at the enemies, and that's about it in a nutshell. And I'll be straight about this game, I didn't like it. There were many issues I had with this game, and the main problem I had were that the controls were very unresponsive and unreliable. As an example, Gordo can run by double tapping the D-pad in the direction you want to run. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Many of the design choices in the game don't make any sense either. The enemies in the first levels are scientists, but why do they walk around like zombies? Also, why is the lady with the needle twice as big as the other scientist? The level layouts are equally bizarre and don't really make any sense to the locations they take place in. It's also pretty annoying if you're in a tight space and jump, because Gordo will bump his head and sit there dazed for a while. Also, why does this lab have so many holes in the ground, and why do they all lead to dungeons? Random dungeons, no less. And some of the dungeons are instant death traps. I mean, there's nothing like jumping in a hole because you didn't see it, and then instantly having hot lava dumped all over you, killing you instantly. Or getting killed by bumping into a wall while on a conveyor belt. There's a lot of instant deaths in this game despite having a life bar. So yeah, I won't outright say this is a bad game, but I'm just gonna give it a 2 and say it's poor. Game 7 is Ishido, The Way of the Stones. And I don't know if that's the correct way to pronounce Ishido, but that's what I'm going with. What we have here is a relaxed, laid-back puzzle game. A game where you don't have to hurry, but you really need to take your time and think about your moves. The game starts out on a board composing of 96 spaces, and there are 6 game pieces preset in the 4 corners and 2 in the center. These game pieces consist of a color and a shape. You then have to place the game pieces on the board in the order in which they are given to you, which I believe is random. Pieces have to be placed to at least one other piece already on the board, and it has to match either color or shape. When placing a piece next to 2 pieces or more, all the pieces have to match either color or shape. You are scored as you go, and the game ends when you either use up all your game pieces or there's nowhere to place your next piece. The game provides plenty of options, such as changing game pieces, scoring system, game type, or even having multiplayer support with the option of the CPU filling in. There's no background music, but I think that's just fine for a game like this. Now, I've heard of this game before, but this was my first time playing it. I'm always interested in trying out new puzzle games, and when I first started playing, I didn't know what to make of it. It seemed a bit easy and maybe a little boring, but as you start putting more and more pieces down, you begin to realize how important the early part of the game is, as you start to see how placing pieces down without paying attention can make it impossible for any piece to occupy certain squares, thus increasing the chances of ending your game early. It's a game where you really need to plan ahead to succeed. It also got me in that just one more game mode, where I played just a little longer than I anticipated. I'll give this game a 4 and say it's good. I don't want to say it's a great game, as it really didn't completely click with me, but there's a solid game here if you're into puzzle games that require some strategy to set up success. Game 8 is Jimmy Connor's Tennis, and this is, of course, a tennis game. And usually tennis games are quite simple to pick up and play. I mean, I think back to the Atari 2600, and there's Activision's Tennis and Atari's Real Sports Tennis. And of course, I also think of Wii Sports Tennis and all of those Mario Tennis games. Usually all easy to pick up and play. Not Jimmy Connor's Tennis, though. Oh no. It took me quite a while before I even figured out how to hit the ball back to my opponent. Basically, as the ball is approaching to you, you'll see an indicator on the ground that's either yellow or red. The confusing thing is that this is not where the ball's going. Rather, it's a rough estimation based on your present location of where you should stand in order to hit the ball. Even if you stand in that spot, you still have to get the button timing correct and hit either the forehand or backhand button depending on where the ball actually is. It takes quite a bit of getting used to. And even when you do start to get the hang of it, the game is pretty difficult even on the most basic level. It also may not be obvious when you're choosing game options, but you can select the gender of the players, the standard or clay court, alter your initials, or even practice against a ball launcher. All of these were things I didn't even know about until well after I started playing. But the standard game is pretty strict about the tournament-style gameplay, and it could take forever to get game, set, and match against the computer. I really struggled, and if you want to see that, you're in luck because I streamed it live on YouTube, and the whole stream should still be up. On the plus side, this game did take me by surprise with the voice samples that are in it, and I got a good chuckle when Jimmy Connors told me I needed more practice.
You can play better than that.
Now, I struggled to give this a score because, yes, the game is difficult and frustrating at times, but on the other hand, I had some fun with it. I'm split on this one, so I'm just going to give it a 3 and say it's okay. Game 4 is Loopz. You gotta pronounce that Z, it's Loopz with a Z. And it's the third puzzle game in this collection, and in this one you are building loops. Hey, it's just like the name of the game. Seriously though, this game is pretty simple. You are given random pieces and you place them on a grid, and when you connect them in a loop, they disappear. The game sounds simple, but in reality it winds up being harder than it sounds. You can focus on making smaller loops, but you won't get as many points as if you were to make bigger loops. But if you make bigger loops, you'll have less places to put pieces that you can't use. It's an interesting balance. Every so often, Pac-Man will appear instead of a regular piece, and he will help you out by erasing a partially formed loop, freeing up space. Well, I really don't think it's supposed to be Pac-Man, but it sure does look like him. One thing I hadn't mentioned that really intensifies the game is that you have a strict time limit to place each piece on the board. If you run out of time without placing it, you lose that piece, and if you lose 3 pieces, the game is over. Sometimes you'll have no choice though, because sometimes a piece may be too big to be placed in any free space on the board, and you'll just have no choice but to lose that piece, so it's important to constantly clear space on the board as you play. The game is difficult, but it's also quite fun and addictive. It has that just one more game element that can make it hard to put down. I have to also mention the game has 3 music tracks to choose from, and they're all pretty good. I streamed this game live, and there were many comments on how good the music was. All in all, I'm going to give this game a 5 and say it's great. Like I said, it's definitely fun and has an addictive quality, and I'll definitely be coming back to this one. Alright everybody, at this point in time we're a little bit over halfway done talking about all the games on this cartridge, so if you're enjoying this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up. Thanks! Game 10 is Malibu Bikini Volleyball, and as can easily be guessed, this is a volleyball game where the women wear bikinis. This was a game I had some difficulty with starting out, but after tweaking the settings a bit to make the ball speed a bit slower than its default, and after getting used to the timing of the buttons, I started to enjoy this quite a bit. It didn't occur to me right away, but this game is very similar to Jimmy Connor's Tennis in the way that the targeting works, except it seems to work a little bit better here. An indicator appears on the ground around where you should be standing to hit the ball, whether it be a bump, set, or spike, and it's up to you to determine the timing of the button press. It's all rather simplistic, but I found the timing to take some getting used to because it always seemed like I needed to hit the buttons far earlier than I felt like it needed to be, especially while spiking. In some cases, it doesn't even look like the characters make contact with the ball, but yet they hit it anyway. There are a few game options here, such as the ability to select your gender, enter a couple of initials in for your character, and select a friendly game or a tournament. Since there's currently no multiplayer support for the Evercade, you're stuck at playing against 2 CPU opponents with another CPU player as your teammate. The only problem is that the CPU is prone to making mistakes, and simple mistakes at that. That goes for all CPU players, whether they're on your team or not. It can be pretty frustrating to be playing a pretty damn good game, setting the ball for your CPU teammate only to have him completely miss for no reason at all. On the flip side though, the graphics are pretty damn impressive for being the chunky pixelated graphics they are. There are 2 background settings. For the regular matches, we're looking out over an ocean and we can see sailboats, swimmers, balloons, and sharks go by. For the tournament settings, we get a set of bleachers that gets more and more populated as you progress. Not only that, but the crowd will follow the ball and get up and cheer in some instances. I thought it was pretty damn impressive. The music, however, is hit and miss. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not bad, but it just sometimes doesn't go with the theme of the game. You can't select the music either, it just cycles through as you play. So one minute you could be listening to something that seems like it belongs in a shoot 'em up, and then the next minute it sounds like it could be a lullaby. I mean, it's pretty bizarre. I had played this game in a live stream for almost 2 hours, and I had a pretty good time with it. I mean, it's certainly not a great game, but it's definitely one I'll say is good. It gets a 4. At number 11, we have a compilation of games titled Megapak Volume 1. Well, I use the word games lightly here, as this is pretty much a collection of homebrew games and other oddities that were created for the Lynx. There are 8 of them here on offer, and an extra hidden game waiting to be unlocked as well. So let's just quickly run through them all right now. Well, first on the list is Parafly, and it's a knockoff Game & Watch game where you must catch parachuters before they hit the ground. Starts off slow but increases in speed as you go. I really wasn't too fond of this one. Second up is Password, and it's pretty much a game of hangman. Keep guessing letters until you've solved the word or run out of attempts. After each word you solve, you'll get a quote or a joke before moving on to the next word. Third up is Lynx Sketch, and it's just a crude drawing program in the guise of an Etch-a-Sketch. While I was streaming this, I had a bit of fun attempting to recreate the 2600 game Video Pinball, but I really can't imagine revisiting this. Fourth on the list is Sound Tool, and I hadn't mentioned it before, but when you boot up this compilation, a melody of familiar tunes starts playing. Sound Tool is your opportunity to mess around with the audio and instruments composing this music and make it sound different. Fifth is Chopper X, and it is easily my favorite game of the compilation. You control a helicopter, you push a button to go higher, and release it to go lower. Pushing the D-pad right will go faster, and left will go slower. You proceed through each level, avoiding the obstacles, trying to get to the end without running out of fuel. The only complaint I have about this game is that there's no indication as to how far you need to go in order to reach the end of the level, but I still had a great time with this one. Sixth is Pontiac, and there's not really much to say about this one. It's just a picture of a Pontiac with seizure-inducing flashing elements. Nothing to control here. This had to be some sort of joke by the developers. Seventh is Blackjack, and it's a simplified game of blackjack where it's you against the dealer, who happens to be a rabbit. You basically play a certain number of hands and get a score at the end. Eighth is High Roller, and it's really just Yahtzee. If you're not familiar with Yahtzee, it's basically poker with dice. It's bare bones and basic, but it works pretty well all the same. The ninth and hidden game in the collection is Treasure. To unlock this, you just have to keep solving words in Password until you receive a message saying you've unlocked it. The game is basically a port of Pirate Adventure by Scott Adams, at least that's what the intro crawl says. It's a text adventure game where the text entry is done by cycling through words on the D-pad. Not ideal, but it works. Not really a bad hidden game. Those are all the games and oddities on this collection, and giving this a score, I've really just got to ignore the games I really didn't like and go with what I did like, and since I really liked Chopper X, I'm going to give this a 4 and say it's good. But without Chopper X, I would have bumped this down a notch. Game 12 is Power Factor, and at first glance, I was pretty interested in playing this game. I mean, from the screenshots I saw, this looked like a platforming shoot-'em-up of sorts, where you do get to control a guy with a jetpack. And that, for the most part, is true. You are indeed a guy with a jetpack whose name happens to be Red Ace, as he navigates a maze of deadly traps and enemies to find the exits in each level. The graphics are pretty big and detailed for a Lynx game, and the bosses are especially impressive, and the sounds aren't bad either. Your rocket pack has a limited amount of fuel, so it does have to be used somewhat sparingly, and you do have a health meter, so fortunately you could take more than a couple hits before you die. And thankfully you could take more than a couple hits, because the enemy and obstacle placements are highly suspect in this game. Some of them hover at just the right height so you can't duck under them as they fly by, and the electro barriers turn on and off in a seemingly random pattern, and the enemies can also fire at you from far off the screen. However, the game really falls apart with the controls. I think they try to do too much with this game, and as a result, controlling Red Ace feels very unnatural. You can have 4 primary weapons and 4 secondary weapons. These are indicated by spots at the bottom of the screen. But when you collect these weapons, selecting an alternate weapon is an absolute nightmare. There's a cursor that's used to highlight these 8 boxes, and the way you move the cursor around is to tap the D-pad left or right. Yes, the same D-pad that's used to control Red Ace is also used to move the cursor. This means that you can't slightly adjust red in turning around or creeping forward a little bit, because tapping the D-pad moves the cursor instead. Also, once the weapon you want to use is highlighted, you still have to press select to activate it. Also, I discovered if you hold down to crouch, red will fire horizontally across the screen, and if you release the button, he'll stand up. But if you tap down, red will crouch and fire up and diagonally, and he also won't move again unless you press up or down. This whole method of controlling red ace is what absolutely kills the game for me. The odd enemy placement can be somewhat forgiven due to the health bar given, especially on easy mode, which is what I spent most of my time playing on, but controlling red ace can be frustrating, and even when I figured out how to do it, I didn't find it very fun. I'm giving this game a 2. Game 13 is Remnant, Planar Wars, and this is a pretty basic homebrew space shooter game, at least I think it was homebrew, that was developed in 2000, and it's somewhat in the vein of games like Star Raiders or Star Masters on the Atari 2600. At least that's what it kind of reminded me of. The gameplay is pretty simple. You're in space, and you try to shoot down the alien spacecrafts while avoiding their fire. You are given a generous amount of shields, which will replenish a little in between waves, and your weapon fire drains your energy a little bit with each shot. And while the energy will replenish automatically, if you drain it completely, you'll have to wait for the meter to recharge a little before shooting again. I feel like this game was only made because the Lynx can scale sprites so well, and although this game can be interesting to play, I feel like it could have used a bit of fine-tuning. For starters, there's no radar in the game, which would have been helpful to locate where enemy craft are on the screen. Also, sometimes it looks like I hit an alien craft, but it doesn't count as a hit. The game is also pretty difficult, as you always have to avoid enemy fire as you cannot shoot their shots to cancel them out. They always have to be avoided, and it can be pretty tedious to line up a shot with a UFO, but then only have to kind of swerve away to avoid the constantly shooting alien craft anyway. While I was looking up info for this game, I stumbled upon some cheat codes, and one of them actually kills all the enemies on the screen instantly. I won't say what the code is here, but it was incredibly easy to perform, so out of curiosity I used the code to see later levels in the game, and it turns out it's just the same 2 types of spaceships again and again, increasing in difficulty, with more and more asteroids appearing. And then, by total surprise, the music changes and there's actually an end boss to the game. But when the boss is defeated, the game just starts all over again. In the end, I'm going to give this game a 3 and say it's just okay. If I could have shot down the enemy fire and had a radar, I might have given this a 4. In the 14th spot is a combo game of Super Asteroids and Super Missile Command, which was originally released in 1994. So when I first saw this title popped up, I thought, oh, this is just going to be Asteroids and Missile Command on the Lynx. But boy, was I wrong about that. These games are actually proper sequels/upgrades to their respective games, and designed with a Lynx's low-resolution screen in mind. With Super Asteroids, you don't have as much space to maneuver around the screen, so they got rid of the one-hit and you're dead convention of the other Asteroids games. Instead, you're given a shield meter as indicated on the right side of the screen. If you get hit, your shield automatically deploys, and your shield meter depletes a little bit. But you also bounce off of whatever you hit, and if you're not careful, you can start to fly uncontrollably around the screen. I thought this made the game immensely more fun than the original. Also, to incentivize you from staying in the middle of the screen, sometimes a power-up may appear, and if collected, can do things like increase your shields, upgrade your weapons temporarily, or even give you some time-limited invincibility. The game will also reset you to the middle of the screen in between waves. This lets you have a fun, frantic-paced game without much punishment for making small mistakes, and I had a great time with this one. But what about Super Missile Command? Well, you get the same treatment here. Same gameplay as the original, but with some bonuses thrown in to make it more fun. When you start playing, you won't really notice much is different from the original. But after the first few waves and before the next stage, you are actually given the option to buy upgrades from a store. This means that there's more of an incentive for you to take out incoming fire with as little ammunition as possible, because this will allow you to earn more money to buy better weapons from the store to use in the next couple waves. And these power-ups are incredibly fun and useful to use as well. Faster shots, more ammo, clustered explosions, Armageddon shots. This might be more fun than Super Asteroids. I'm really amazed that these two incredible sequels to classic games were hiding on the Lynx the entire time. This dual combo game easily gets a 5, and I wouldn't be surprised if this winds up being my #1 title on this Evercade cartridge. Game 15 is Scrapyard Dog, and oh boy, this one is a doozy. I'll start by mentioning that this one is a side-scrolling platformer that also appeared on the Atari 7800, and while both versions have some similarities, the games are also very different. Based on what I saw, the Lynx version seems to be the superior version. The plot of the game is that you play as Louie, the owner of the junkyard, and your dog Scraps, the titular Scrapyard Dog, is dognapped by a gang led by Mr. Big. Now, why did Mr. Big kidnap your dog? Well, the funny thing is that the game doesn't tell you. Neither does the original Lynx manual. I actually had to look in the manual for the 7800 version for an explanation. And that explanation is that Mr. Big wants the deed to Louie's junkyard. Well, glad that information was somewhere, otherwise this game would make less sense than it already does. So, Louie starts chasing after Scraps in an effort to rescue him without giving up his junkyard. Louie is armed with an unlimited amount of cans, but can find shops hidden throughout the levels that offer weapon upgrades, extra lives, or shields. There's a lot of hidden secrets in the levels like these stores, and there's also hidden mini games and shortcuts throughout the levels, or who knows, you might even get sent backwards through the level. But as I mentioned, the game doesn't make much sense. But that's one of the things I really like about this game. Sometimes I didn't quite believe what I was seeing. Apparently this is a world where animals may or may not be anthropomorphic. Right from the very beginning, a dog dressed as a gangster pops on the screen shooting his gun. Then he throws your dog in a sack and gets away in an escape vehicle. And the game only gets stranger from there. During my live stream, I wound up streaming for over 2.5 hours because I wanted to see everything this game had to offer, and boy, was I not disappointed. At the end of every stage, there's a boss you need to defeat, and sometimes I had to pause the game because I just didn't believe what I was seeing. You know, a dog in a tank, a rocket pack wearing raccoon, a ghost cowboy, and let's not forget Mr. Big, who himself is a large dog dressed as a gangster boss who's smoking a cigar. Really, the design of everything in this game is something to behold. I only wish that the platforming physics were a bit better and the objects I could stand on were a little bit better defined, so I can't say the game is great, but it's certainly good and I'm gonna give it a 4. Game 16 is Super Skweek, and this is an action puzzler from 1991 wherein you play as the titular Skweek as he tackles hundreds of levels wherein the king will summon him and tell him what he needs to do, which usually consists of turning all the blue tiles in a level pink, although sometimes he'll tell you to rescue the Skweekettes in a level instead. There are a few things that took me by surprise in this game. Firstly, the levels are huge. Way bigger than I think they needed to be. Secondly, there are a ton of power-ups for a game like this. When you start out, you turn the tiles to pink just by walking over them, and you can also shoot enemies with a standard shot. But icons will appear, and they can alter multiple aspects of your movement, the enemy's movements, upgrade your shots, give you shields or invincibility, or even affect the tiles you are changing. There are just so many power-ups, and I find that impressive. What's also impressive is the number of levels in the game. I'm not sure how many levels there are, but it's easily over 250. I had high hopes for this game, but ultimately it falls pretty flat for me. Everything in the game seems like it would be tile-based, but it's not. You and the enemies can move wherever and however you want. What winds up happening is due to this, I thought I'd be lined up on one tile, but I was actually on another, and it led to me falling off of platforms pretty frequently. And it can also be difficult to line up shots with enemies. I just kind of think it would have been better if you and the enemies were tile locked. Also, either the levels are just too big or they're zoomed in way too much. For the number of enemies roaming around, it's just far too easy to run into something appearing on the screen quickly before you realize it. Also, some of the levels have these multi-platform thing going on, and it's just sometimes not clear what level you or the enemy is on because the sprites don't change in size, and we all know that's something the Lynx can easily do. This game does give you a ton of lives, but I would fly through them pretty quickly. In a standard game, I could only make it to level 3 without using save states. There is a random game option wherein you play levels randomly, and I thought that was an interesting way to see the levels I wouldn't have normally seen, but I honestly could not complete most of them, even with a ton of lives in reserve. I just kinda lost interest in this game after about 45 minutes. I'll give this one a 3 and say it's just okay. I don't think it's a bad game, but I think it could have been a lot more fun, especially with all those power-ups and levels. The last game on the cartridge is Xump, The Final Run. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly, but that's what I'm going to go with. The interesting thing about this game is that it was released in 2019 by Retro Guru, and it's available on many different platforms for free off of the official website. Songbird Productions is publishing and licensing the physical Lynx version, and that's where you'd have to pay money to play the game. This is a simple puzzle game with 48 levels where you simply have to cross every tile on the board to make them disappear without falling off. In some cases, there's a bomb that needs to be defused on these tiles, making it necessary to cross over those tiles twice before they disappear. Throwing a monkey wrench into the whole premise is that you cannot stand indefinitely on any one of the disappearing tiles, as they will disappear while you're standing on them. Also, there may be some tiles that'll force you into a certain direction or prevent you from moving in a certain way. Also, you must make sure to end your run on a solid tile, and it doesn't count if the last tile disappears while you're standing on it. The game was incredibly fun, but I had a major issue with it. The movement with the D-pad seemed way too sensitive. You could hold the D-pad down to move, but you'll lose accuracy, and that's absolutely critical for not falling off the path. So I switched to just tapping the D-pad for every move, but I found my character jumping ahead 2 tiles instead of just 1 sometimes. And this was just incredibly annoying, as some of the levels can be quite lengthy, and it totally sucks to have to restart it just because your character decided to move farther than you expected to and jump into the abyss. It's not just me either, as this complaint was made in the chat while I was streaming the game as well. I downloaded and booted up the Windows version of the game, and that issue didn't seem to exist there, so it just seems like either it's an issue with the Lynx version or the Lynx version on the Evercade. And because of this, I've got to knock the game down a notch and say it's just good and give it a 4. If it weren't for that one issue, I could have easily given this a 5. Alright, that's going to wrap up all the games that are available in the Atari Lynx Collection one. Not a bad mix of games, especially considering that all these games were meant for a handheld device to begin with. But looking at the scores for every single one of these games, I gave 3 out of 17 games a great score and 7 a good score. So like 10 out of the 17 I consider to be like well worth playing, at least in my eyes. And then of course I gave 4 of them an okay, and then 3 of them just poor, you know, kind of games I kind of don't really want to go back to. But overall, it is a good mix and well worth picking up. And so that's going to wrap it up for this video. The next one is of course going to be the Atari Lynx Collection 2. And even though there are fewer games on that collection, I'm kind of looking forward to it because I've been hearing it may be the better of the two. So until next time, see you then. Bye.